Welcome to the Life Unfiltered channel. Real stories that will make you reflect and uncover situations that often remain hidden behind closed doors. Today, I'm going to share Anna's story with you, an emotional tale that might just offer some important life lessons. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and click the notification bell so you never miss any of these inspiring stories. My name is Anna. I'm 43 years old, and from the outside, my life seems picture perfect. I live in Santos, a beautiful seaside city, and own a beachwear boutique. I take good care of myself, spend much of my free time at the gym, and often hear that I look younger than I actually am. People even say my daughter and I could pass as sisters. Sophia, my only daughter, is 20 years old and my greatest pride. She's studying psychology, full of dreams, and always brings that youthful spark that reminds me of how I used to be at her age. She's dating Gabriel, a handsome, polite, and athletic 25-year-old who stands at 6'3". He works as an IT analyst at a large company and has gradually become part of our family routine. My husband, Carlos, is 50 and works as a lawyer. He's a calm, hardworking family man who runs his own law office right here in Santos. He shares a passion for soccer with Gabriel, and you'll often find the two of them in the living room on weekends, watching their favorite team's games. Our apartment is cozy and spacious, the kind of place that exudes stability and security. For a long time, I believed this was my life: stable, comfortable, predictable. But sometimes, smiles conceal cracks that only we can see. I've always been someone who seeks control, who plans everything down to the smallest detail. But there are things you simply can't control: desire, choices, mistakes, and their consequences. That's what brought me to this point, to a moment where everything I thought I knew began to shift, and maybe even crumble. I never imagined my life could take the turn it did. I always thought I lived an ordinary life: work, family, the gym. And yet I found myself in a place I should never have reached. Perhaps it was vanity, maybe restlessness. Or maybe it was something deeper, something even I can't fully explain. I say this because everything seemed perfect, or at least stable. I used to look at my life and think I had everything a woman could want: a devoted husband, a wonderful daughter, and a thriving bikini shop. Carlos, my husband, was always the type of man who was calm and content with what he had, happy with the routine we'd built. He always made me feel secure. There were never any big surprises or sudden changes, which made our life feel solid, like a rock. A rock that, at first glance, seemed unshakable. Sophia, my daughter, was and always will be my greatest pride. Beautiful, intelligent, full of dreams, with a promising future ahead of her. When I looked at her, I couldn't help but think about how fast time flies. When she introduced me to Gabriel, her boyfriend, I immediately noticed there was something captivating about him. Beyond being handsome, he was charming and fun. He was tall, athletic, and naturally charismatic. Not the shy type, quite the opposite. He had this unique ability to make friends wherever he went, someone who could walk into any room and instantly make it lighter, more enjoyable. He was always smiling, always ready with a joke, always willing to make everyone around him feel comfortable. And in my ignorance, I liked that about him. He was just so pleasant. It wasn't just his looks, of course. It was more about the energy he carried with him. I enjoyed being in his company, even though I knew he was my daughter's boyfriend, even though I knew our relationship should be confined to what's expected between a son-in-law and a mother-in-law. Always respectful, always at a distance. But deep down, I couldn't help feeling that his presence attracted me in a strange way. Gabriel seemed to fit perfectly into our family. He and Carlos got along well, sharing the same passion for our local soccer team, Santos. Whenever Santos had a game, they would gather in the living room, laughing and discussing plays as if they were right there in the stadium. Watching them, I would think to myself, what a happy family, what a peaceful life. But despite the harmony on the surface, there was something about Gabriel that unsettled me, something I tried to ignore. I noticed that he looked at me in a way that wasn't normal for a son-in-law. There were moments when I'd catch him staring, his eyes fixed on me. When I looked back at him, he would smile, an innocent smile on the surface, but one that left me uneasy. Sometimes, when Gabriel and Sophia were in the living room, he'd hold her affectionately, with her head resting on his lap. It was the kind of tenderness you'd expect from a young couple in love. And yet, there were moments when I'd glance at them and feel something I couldn't quite put into words. He'd look at me, not like a son-in-law respecting his mother-in-law, but with a gaze that lingered, a gaze that seemed to measure me, to study me. When I noticed and caught him, he'd quickly avert his eyes, as if trying to act normal. But I knew he knew I had seen him. It wasn't what he said, it was the way he looked at me. His gaze carried a weight, an intensity that made me uncomfortable. And it happened often enough that I couldn't brush it off. I noticed it, I felt it, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, those looks began to gnaw at me. Each time his eyes lingered, I felt more confused, more unsure of myself. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was all in my head, that maybe I was overthinking things. But as time went on, it became harder to deny. Things seemed to intensify. When Sophia wasn't around and Carlos was at work, Gabriel would linger in the kitchen, chatting with me. I'd do my best to maintain a neutral, casual atmosphere, one befitting a typical mother-in-law and son-in-law relationship, but there was no denying the tension that hung in the air between us. It was in his eyes, in the way he held my gaze, in the pauses that felt too long. It was as though he was trying to unravel me, to understand me on a level that went beyond what was appropriate. And what scared me the most wasn't him, it was my own reaction. The uncertainty of how I should respond, the unease of knowing that I didn't entirely reject the attention. It left me feeling trapped, caught in a web of emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. I cherished the moments when Gabriel arrived or left, because those were the times he hugged me. In those brief seconds, I felt his tall, strong frame wrapping around me, the warmth of his body close to mine, and the scent of his cologne lingering in the air. It was a unique, almost indescribable sensation. Although his hugs and glances never crossed the line or were accompanied by inappropriate words, there was something in the way he treated me, in the intensity of his gaze, that made me feel as though I were stepping into dangerous territory, a space I knew I should never have allowed myself to enter. Despite knowing he was Sophia's boyfriend and that the boundaries between us were clear, I couldn't ignore the undeniable attraction I felt toward him. My mind would wander to imaginary scenarios, stolen moments alone with Gabriel, in the store, at home, in situations that could never come to pass. They were fantasies, and I was fully aware of their impossibility. He was my daughter's boyfriend, and that reality drew an unbreakable line in the sand. Sometimes, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that he didn't look at me the way I thought he did. But then there were moments that left no room for doubt. In the kitchen, for instance, when he walked by me, never touching, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. It felt intentional, as if he were testing the waters, trying to see how far he could go without crossing the boundary. Gabriel had a boldness about him, a quiet confidence that hinted he might, eventually, push the limits. And yet, I was prepared. I had rehearsed what I would say to shut him down if he ever dared to act on the tension between us. Because no matter what I felt, or how tempting the idea might be in fleeting moments of weakness, he was my daughter's boyfriend. That single truth anchored me, reminding me of what was at stake and the line I could never, ever cross. Every time Gabriel arrived home, it was a burst of joy. I was usually in my workout clothes, a habit that gradually turned into something more intentional. I began to pay closer attention to what I wore, aware of the tension simmering between us. Day by day, the unspoken dynamic between us became more evident. The glances were no longer subtle, not from him nor from me. Without a single word exchanged, it was clear. He knew about my desire, just as I knew about his for me. Months went by, and that same charged atmosphere lingered. It wasn't limited to private moments at home. It extended to family gatherings and events. In fact, many times we'd go out as a group, me, Carlos, Sophia, and Gabriel, to a nearby restaurant with live music. Gabriel often asked me to dance, and I never refused. I loved the feeling of his body close to mine, the way his hand rested lightly on my waist. Then came the day when everything shifted. I was on my way to São Paulo to check out new bikinis for my store, when my car broke down near the toll plaza. It was mid-afternoon, around 4, but I still felt uneasy being alone on the side of the road. I called Carlos first. He apologized, explaining that he was tied up in a court hearing, and suggested I call the insurance company for roadside assistance. Feeling anxious, I decided to call Gabriel. He didn't hesitate. Within no time, he arrived on his motorcycle, the sound of the engine announcing his presence before I even saw him. As he took off his helmet, his smile was reassuring, yet there was something more in his eyes, a glint of excitement, as though he knew this moment might change everything. I hadn't contacted the insurance company yet. I was waiting for Gabriel to arrive before making the call. I didn't know the steps to take, as Carlos always handled these kinds of situations. Sitting in my car on the side of the road, my heart raced, my mind buzzing with worry. The nerves were overwhelming, and the fear of being stranded there alone only heightened my sense of vulnerability. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the highway, making the scene feel even more isolating. Then, in the distance, I heard the rumble of a motorcycle engine. When Gabriel finally came into view, riding towards me, a wave of relief washed over me so strongly it was almost physical. Without thinking, I ran toward him the moment he parked his bike, throwing my arms around him in a tight embrace. It wasn't calculated. It was pure instinct, driven by the relief of not being alone anymore and the reassurance of knowing he could help me. For a moment, I stayed there, holding on to him, my head against his chest as the sound of his steady heartbeat calmed me. His scent, clean, masculine, with a hint of his cologne, was intoxicating, and I couldn't ignore how safe and comforted I felt in his arms. He hugged me back, a little surprised at first, but then his hand settled on my back, firm yet gentle. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady and calming. "I'm here now. We'll figure it out." I pulled away slightly, looking up at him, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something that mirrored the storm of emotions I was feeling. It was as though, in that fleeting second, neither of us knew where the boundaries were anymore. "Thank you for coming so quickly," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Of course," he replied, his tone warm. "Let's get this sorted out." But even as he turned his attention to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. A line had been crossed, even if just emotionally. And deep down, I knew this moment would linger in my mind long after the issue with the car was resolved. Gabriel's lips met mine with an urgency that neither of us could deny. The world seemed to blur, the distant hum of passing cars fading into nothingness. His hands, firm yet gentle, cupped my face, pulling me closer, as if to close the gap that had been growing between us all this time. For a fleeting moment, my mind screamed at me to stop, to think of Sophia, of Carlos, of the boundaries we were shattering. But my body betrayed me. The warmth of his touch and the intensity of his kiss ignited something inside me that had been dormant for years. It wasn't just desire, it was a need to feel alive, to be seen, to be wanted. Everything between us was so hot, so intense, that we couldn't think about anything but enjoying the moment. It felt like the universe had conspired to put us there, in that situation. Gabriel asked me to follow him on his motorcycle, and together we headed to a place where couples park their cars to be alone and enjoy each other. By that point, the atmosphere seemed tailor-made for us. The heat of the night, the low music playing in the car, the adrenaline, it all blended together, creating an environment charged with desire. In the car, the tension between us turned into something overwhelming. We did everything we could, everything that moment allowed us to do, and what happened there was indescribable. I, a 43-year-old woman with experience, had never felt anything so intense, so deep, as if the anticipation had made everything even more explosive. Each touch, each movement, led me to a new peak, a sensation so overwhelming that I didn't know I could experience it. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was just the intensity of the desire that consumed me. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was just the intensity of the desire consuming me. Meanwhile, my phone kept ringing. It was Carlos, my husband. The persistent sound of the phone seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the intensity of what was happening right there in the car. When I finally realized it, time had stretched, as if those minutes in the car had lasted hours. When our hearts finally started to slow down, I called Carlos, trying to mask my agitation, and told him that Gabriel had arrived, fixed the car, and left, and that I had gone shopping and forgot to let him know. The truth was, I hadn't gone shopping that day. I went home with a wonderful feeling, my body still buzzing from everything that had happened, but my mind was a mess, completely consumed by thoughts of Gabriel. I couldn't get that 25-year-old guy out of my head. He was there, consuming me, haunting every thought. And at the same time, guilt started to settle in. I knew he was my daughter's boyfriend, and that made everything feel even more overwhelming. I needed to get him out of my head, push those feelings away, but something inside me just couldn't. It was an internal battle, and as I drove back home, I knew the road to pushing him out of my mind would be harder than I had imagined. After that day, everything changed between Gabriel and me. With every encounter, the sexual tension was palpable. With all sorts of excuses to seek me out, he'd drop off my daughter in her room and with a mischievous grin, claim he was thirsty, looking for me in the kitchen. It was as if he was searching for any reason to be near me. His touches were bold, unexpected, and his kisses were intense and overwhelming. With each meeting, my adrenaline would pump through my veins. In those moments when we were in the store, he'd pull me into a more secluded corner, as if he couldn't resist our attraction any longer. The intensity of that passion was overwhelming. I had never experienced anything so strong, so visceral. With every encounter, doubt would creep in. Could I resist this feeling? But the truth is, I felt hypnotized, surrendered to a greater force that was propelling me forward. So, I decided to let myself live this love without reservations, without worrying about the future. Only the present mattered. Gabriel and I started meeting almost every day during lunch breaks. It was a safe moment since Carlos was at work and Sophia was at college. We would take advantage of this time to meet at the back of the store, where our passion for each other became intense and unrestrained. For 2 months, this routine continued until one day something unexpected happened. Eduardo, Carlos's brother, caught us in the act. He came into the store and, without hesitation, went straight to the back where he found us naked. The scene was shocking, and Eduardo was furious. He lunged at Gabriel, punching him so hard that he made him bleed from his mouth. In his rage, Eduardo insulted me in every possible way, calling me a bitch, saying I was making a fool of Carlos and accusing me of hurting my own daughter. He threatened to tell my husband, and fear overtook me. I spent the whole day crying, terrified of what might happen when I got home. I returned home later, and to my surprise, Carlos and Sophia were sitting at the table, eating pizza. Carlos asked me where I had been, but when I observed their behavior, I realized nothing had changed. I felt relieved, as Eduardo apparently hadn't told Carlos anything. However, Sophia seemed worried, saying that she could no longer reach Gabriel, who hadn't returned her calls. She was upset and didn't understand what was going on. The next day, Sophia came home crying. She told me that Gabriel had broken up with her without any explanation and said he was moving abroad, something he had never mentioned before. Sophia was devastated, nearly fell into depression, and spent almost a month not going to college. Carlos, concerned, went to Gabriel's house, but the doorman always said he wasn't home. Gabriel simply disappeared from our lives. He left without giving any explanation, leaving behind not only my daughter, but also a great friendship with my husband, who was devastated by what had happened. 2 days later, my brother-in-law called me and surprisingly said he wouldn't speak to Carlos about what had happened. He said he didn't want to hurt my daughter even more, that she didn't deserve to know the truth. As a loving uncle, he chose to hide the reality. It's been 10 months since that day. Sophia still hasn't recovered. She lives in sadness, isolated, and although she's gone back to college, she's lost the spark in her eyes. She doesn't want to know about relationships anymore. And to make things worse, Gabriel really did cut ties, moving to Dublin, Ireland. I look at what our home has become, and I know I made the wrong choice. I sacrificed the harmony of my family for an impulsive passion. My relationship with my husband also worsened. I no longer have the desire to be with him, and he's saddened to see Sophia in this state. our relationship as a couple has been harmed as well. Today, looking back, I understand that I couldn't control my impulses. I know that any woman in my place, overwhelmed by the intensity of such a strong passion, could have done the same. However, I now see that things could have been different if I had made other decisions. This was Anna's story on Unfiltered Life. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Here, we always bring real-life stories so you can reflect and learn from the experiences of others. Take a look at the description and watch these 2 videos I recommend for you. See you in the next Unfiltered Life story.